So there is health, there is feelings, and then there is the law. And so let's look at the legal angles of this conversation around NARD, especially given that the Minister of Labour and Employment, Dr. Chris Ngige, has brought that in. And of course, Adegboruwa joins us this morning. He is a senior advocate of Nigeria. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Well, first of all, how does it, hit you? There was an agreement more than 113 days before the doctors decided, look, we're not hearing anything, we're not feeling anything, we don't think anything is happening, so let's resume the strike, we suspend it.
Well, I don't think the scenario playing out currently is peculiar to doctors. Virtually every sector of the Nigerian state is experienced one form of withdrawal of service or the other, to the extent that even policemen some times ago also went on strike. Lecturers have been on strike. Doctors are on strike. Teachers have gone on strike. The general feeling within the employees is that the best language that the employer probably understands, especially in public service circles, is to embark on some form of withdrawal service or the other. And it's quite unfortunate because in most cases, notices are issued. In most cases, efforts are made to convey the grievances of the employees to the employer. And it's quite unfortunate that in our experience in Nigeria, it is when strike commences that efforts are made to discuss, which has been the experience all the time. But I think that going by the facts of this particular case, the issues being raised by the doctors should generate national concern because at the end of the day, if they are not well resolved amicably, it is the masses that will suffer the brunt because they are the ones that patronize the public hospitals.
And that unfortunately has been
happening. That should be playing well in the mind of those who are concerned, because I was reasoning with you before we came live, that the people who are in charge of this situation are the first medical doctors. The Minister of State, Honorable Minister of State for Health, who just spoke to you now, is a medical doctor. The Minister of Health himself is a medical doctor. And then the Minister in charge of Labor and Productivity is also a medical doctor. So they should have peculiar information. They should have knowledge of the peculiarity of what doctors are going through, and not just be relying on legalism to try to outwit one another. Otherwise, I don't think it's a matter you resolve in the court of law at the end of the day. If parties had signed an agreement some 113 days ago, you can then just go international and be citing ILO articles as a means of trying to twist the hands of the folks who are on strike, because the right to strike is universal and is recognized by law. And if notices were duly given, then you will not go back and invoke the provisions of the Trade Dispute Act to try to take away the salaries of those who gave you notice and you didn't do anything. So there is a fault on the part of the authorities who received the notice. There is a fault on the part of the authorities who sat down with the medical doctor to sign a memorandum of action. And in that memorandum of action, certain things were agreed upon. If those things have not been implemented on the part of the government, then you don't just unilaterally invoke the provisions of the Trade Dispute Act.
That's not to say it's not relevant, but we'll come to that one.
Yes.
But one of the things that the Honorable in charge of the Committee for Health, the Chairman, House Committee on Health, Honorable Sununu spoke. He talked about insincerity of government. But in the defense of government, the Minister of State for Health, Dr. Mamora, said, look, the wheel of government moves very, very slowly. It's not that government is not doing anything, but it's so frustratingly slow, even for them who are in government. How do you feel about that one?
I think it's something that we need to acknowledge, that bureaucracy is quite very enormous and it's quite slow. At times when we issue letters on behalf of clients to government departments and agencies, I do advise my clients that you give extra 1 month, 2 months, because files will move from one table to the other and may take time. So it is true that bureaucratic bottlenecks at times work to frustrate genuine intentions, even on the part of government. And that should play in the mind of the doctors because they are also in the system. So at times, you cannot, maybe purely because of issues relating to bureaucracy, then shift the blame on the government all the time. And so in that regard, I enjoin the medical doctors to also take that into consideration. Perhaps things have to follow a particular process before you get issues resolved. For instance, on the issue of residency, you know, I mean, in 2018, President Muhammad Buhari signed the Residency Training Act, which gives the opportunity for doctors who are going through trainings to become junior registrars and senior registrars to have access to certain facilities and funding. Well, that's a federal law. You cannot impose it on states, you know. So the states have the discretion through their houses of assembly to domesticate the Residency Training Act and make it applicable to the states. And it's one of the reasons why this strike is on, as part of the 17 items listed in the next meeting of National Association of Resident Doctors. So that, for instance, it probably is not a matter that you can achieve in one day. As you notice that even judiciary staff workers currently, recently also went on a strike to get the states to implement judicial autonomy and financial autonomy for the judiciary. So it took a process, and some states are now promulgating laws by which they try to give autonomy to the judiciary. So I think doctors should also recognize that such a matter may not be achieved immediately in terms of domestication, because it has to go through the House of Assembly of the states and then probably go to the governor of those states. And I don't think those are matters you blame on the federal government generally.
But do you think then, in the light of what you just said now, that maybe the NARD doctors acted too hastily?
Well, I won't say they acted too hastily, but that probably it may not be advisable to sustain the strike on such grounds as domestication of the Residency Training Act. And I say that because I'm concerned about the effect of this on the masses. It's not that one is not considerate of the welfare of the resident doctors themselves, but I think that the ultimate being that it's an essential service that affects the general populace. The people who are concerned about this have their own hospitals, they have their own doctors. The president has just gone abroad to attend to his medical conditions. And so probably these people will not be affected by the strike action. I'm concerned about the masses. So there should be a middle ground by which the doctors and the government can return to the negotiation table. And I'm glad that they have a meeting by 11 o'clock today. So I think that essentially it's to look at some kind of concession by which the doctors may be able to return to their work.
Well, when you talk about the fact that, I mean, the will of government moves very, very slowly when it comes to paying, but when it comes to issuing certain guidelines, it happens almost expeditiously, because, I mean, one of the things that the NARD is not happy with is the fact that there was a circular from the head of service of the Federation removing house officers from the scheme of service and the consequent implementation by the Lagos state government. Like, okay, so you can do that expeditiously, but you can't pay our money expeditiously. Perhaps that's something that really got to them.
Well, I think that, honestly, following what the House Committee Chairman explained to us today, is that people who are responsible for bureaucracy in terms of matters relating to essential services should be sanctioned. Because from his explanation, I mean, the doctors are not to blame. You cannot engage people without following due process. And having engaged them and they have rendered service, they're entitled to be paid for the service that is rendered. So you don't just unilaterally on your own then decide to remove them, because they didn't employ themselves. They were employed by certain people and following a particular process. So if there's a particular process that has not been followed to consummate that employment, then you don't punish the people who have rendered service. Okay. Because they have attended to patients who have benefited in terms of care. And so you should not then withhold the payment. And for the states that have gone ahead so quickly to implement the policies of removing house officers from the scheme, I think is quite very unfortunate. And that's talking about the sincerity on the part of government.
Okay.
I will appeal to the states to reinstate them pending the period when this negotiation is concluded.
I want to ask you questions around the Trade Disputes Essential Services Act, but that will be after this conversation that you're about to have with Mokwe.
Well, it's good to see you, Mr. Adegboruwa, ICN. I'm just wondering, because you've already made mention of it, the essential services sector, the fact that the services that these doctors render is extremely important to the masses. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on who should be held responsible. Because in recent times, I mean, we've seen a number of outbreaks. Right now, we're talking about COVID-19. A number of states are battling with cholera. We understand about 60 people are said to have died as a result of cholera, a totally preventable illness. Now, if during the period of the strike, we're able to see more deaths that accrue, and we're able to prove their linkage with the strike action, who do you think should be held responsible for the deaths, or should we just leave it that way?
Well, thank you, Mokwe. I think that, like I said, any service, the interruption of which will cause danger to public health, public safety, to a part or whole of a community, is termed to be an essential service under the International Labour Organization conventions and regulations. So to that extent, any service relating to hospitals, armed forces, electricity, telephones, and such other essential services should naturally be expected to continue, uninterrupted. But of course, you recognize that the people who render the essential service themselves are human beings. So their life should probably be more essential than the service that they render. So to that extent, we have to find some kind of measuring rod by which you will have to gauge the quality of their service if their life is in danger. It is said that about 19 doctors or more than that died in the course of attending to COVID, and that the lives of others are probably at risk. And no insurance is being paid to their family. Hazard allowances are not being paid. The doctors are being owed salaries by some states of upward of about 6 months. So to that extent, the law will also be made to look at the life of the person rendering the essential service. And that's why it's required under the Trade Dispute Act that you should give notice before you can withdraw such essential service. And doctors in this instance claim that they have issued that notice. And the fact that the federal government signed a memorandum of action with them some 113 days ago is an indication of the fact that the government is aware of the issues. So really, if you ask me who to blame, I would say it's the government, in the sense that you knew the nature of this service and the consequence of its withdrawal. And so efforts should have been made to ensure that there is no interruption by attending punctually to the issues raised by the doctors. Otherwise, you will know that if they gave you a notice that they were going to withdraw service at so and so time, it is incumbent on the relevant authorities to do all in their powers to ensure that that notice does not translate into a strike action. On the part of the resident doctors, well, I mean, it's by choice to belong to the medical profession. I studied law by choice. So before you went into this profession, you knew the hazards, you knew the consequences, you knew the importance of the profession itself in terms of your covenant to save lives. So I will also appeal to them to also put that into consideration in terms of whether there's need for us to go back to the table to negotiate and resume services while the negotiation is ongoing. Otherwise, I don't think it's proper to prolong a strike that affects the life of human beings to an indefinite extent that we don't know when it will be called off, because the masses are the ones suffering. Thank you.
Well, it is. I think it's very important that background is laid in terms of who should carry responsibility. It's sad that, when we say that government should take responsibility, it almost means nothing, because oftentimes, you know, how do you hold government responsible? What is the consequence, for instance, when government fails to carry out its own roles as and when due to prevent actions such as this? You know, apart from them, you know, just accepting the criticism or taking or people giving criticism, it would seem that there is no real consequence to government when this kind of thing happens. Unlike assuming it were doctors where you could say, for instance, right now, government is threatening that these doctors, if they don't resume today, oh, we're going to implement no work, no pay. We also heard the Minister of Labour saying in some instances you could be sacked. What happens to government officials, for instance? Can they be sacked as well? There are huge questions in that regard. But I wanted to take you up on something that the Minister of Labour said. He talked about how, you know, the spending on health is not just what is captured in the budget for health. It's also in other sectors such as water and sanitation. And he also talked about how there is, you know, we spend a lot of money absorbing our doctors into residency training. There have been talks as to how Nigeria spends a lot in subsidizing tertiary education for its numerous citizens and those who in tertiary education, including the medical schools. But sadly, we don't seem to benefit a lot more from it when our doctors finally finish school. We've seen a move by a number of countries around the world to come and poach our doctors. Even during a COVID-19 pandemic, we saw a situation whereby, you know, foreign missions brought aeroplanes here and gave very, very lucrative conditions of service to our own doctors, you know, just to get them to their own places. How do you think that, because some people say that we're in a very vulnerable place and maybe, you know, we have to take into cognizance our own economy as well and what we really can afford. What changes do you think we can make to benefit? I mean, apart from appealing to the patriotism of our doctors, what else can we do, and legally speaking now, to ensure that somehow we're able to benefit also from the services of doctors whose training, and I don't know if you agree with this, whose training we have somewhat subsidized?
Thank you very much. First is to answer the question as to the consequences of certain inactions on the part of government agencies or officers. I think the National Assembly should have, it's a matter of urgency in order to avoid a repeat of what is going on now. It set up some kind of panel to probe the actions or inactions of certain officers of government involved in the current imbroglio. It is alleged that some doctors were engaged, you know, without following due process. Somebody should be responsible for that. The person who interviewed them, the person who issued letters without following due process and exposing the doctors to rendering services without payment, such people should be sanctioned, you know, so that it will serve as a lesson, you know, and then the doctors can also be satisfied that action has been taken. Otherwise, without justice, you can't achieve progress. But about what can be done in order to let our doctors benefit, I think a point being raised in the current dispute is the issue of domestication of the Residency Training Act. I will appeal to the governors of the states through the Governors Forum to do the same way they did with judicial staff workers when they went on strike. It's to be able to domesticate the Residency Training Act to ensure that it's applicable in the states, because the benefits are quite enormous, both to the doctors and even to the government itself, when you can centralize the system of training and then you can achieve some kind of uniformity and standardization to ensure that, you know, the right standard is being applied in the training of those who are to treat the sick. So that is important when you talk about legality, is that it must be domesticated to ensure that, I mean, it's applicable in all the states of the Federation.
Okay. I have so many things to ask you, but I can't let you go without asking you about this NSAS thing. It's about 10 months already now since, you know, these panels were set up all over the nation. And you are a member of the one in Lagos. What update can you give us? Because many people will probably say, back to business as usual.
Well, I think that if you followed our proceedings, the Lagos panel is quite unique, you know, and in the sense that the Lekki toll gate incidents of October 2020, has been added to our terms of reference. And that has more or less taken the chunk of our time, because we needed to listen to pathologists, we needed to listen to medical doctors, we needed to listen to forensic experts, we needed to even listen to the Lagos State government itself, we needed to listen to the Nigerian Army. So that has taken like half of our primary assignment. But in the course of that, we've also tried to attend to the usual petitions of abuses of citizens by police and other security agencies. And in cases where we found government culpable, we've awarded damages, not just to award the damages, but to ensure that payment is received in that regard. So as we are presently, we are continuing with the Lekki Tollgate incidents, and we want to fast-track that. Okay. So that is being done by amending our rules to ensure that there's front-loading. Okay. You can bring all your evidence and your documents ahead of time so that the other party can look at it. Okay. And then we fast-track the period of hearing a petition to ensure that maybe cross-examination will not take more than 30 minutes in that regard. Okay. But honestly, nobody can say when we will finish. I'm not even sure we can finish this year. Because right now, we still have over 100 petitions, wow, which we have not attended to open at all.
It's gratifying that at least it's not dead. You know, even though it's not on the front pages, it's not something that has gone under. But and we can only wish you well, and thank you for all the services.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Adegboruwa is a senior advocate of Nigeria. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
For your thoughts this morning.